Now, the British Prime Minister is set to introduce an annual system to award new oil and gas licences in the North Sea in order to help bolster the UK's energy security and secure 200,000 jobs. Well, the licensing will support lower carbon emissions and be contingent on specific tests to help the UK transition to net zero by 2050 in a pragmatic, proportionate and realistic way. Of course, we're not going to be net zero in 2050, but if you ignore that small point. But also, of course, the move is likely to anger the usual people, anger environmental campaigners, including, you guessed it, Just Stop Oil. Joining me now to discuss this is the former director at UK Onshore Oil and Gas, that's Charles McAllister. Good morning to you.
Morning, Delia. How are you? Very
well indeed. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Look, just tell us first of all what this means, because this was announced by Claire Coutinho. She's the Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary of State. I've always said, you can't be energy security and net zero at the same time. It's one or the other. But what does this actually mean?
Okay, so taken in isolation, it is a good thing. I mean, we are going to need oil and gas for decades. That's an absolute fact, and it is better to produce it in the UK. And what they've done is they've used two tests from the climate compatibility checkpoint to justify new licenses. The first is that the UK will always have to be more reliant on imports, but the language needs to be very careful on that. And at what time should that apply? So we need to see more detail on that. And the second is that domestic production would always have to be less carbon intensive than liquefied natural gas that we import. Now, that is always going to be the case because LNG is incredibly carbon intensive. What it is it's natural gas produced in, say, the United States, Qatar, and then it's frozen to minus 163 degrees Celsius, put on a big boat, and then shipped thousands of miles to the UK. So producing it locally is always going to be better. My two issues with this, quite frankly, number one is this doesn't override the disincentive from investment from the windfall tax, which is having a big knock-on effect on investment in the UK oil and gas sector. My second issue is why isn't this being applied onshore to the fracking sector? There's still a moratorium on fracking in England.
Yeah, indeed. It is absolutely fascinating. I've seen some of the interviews on the various different breakfast shows where I like to sort of go around all the different media. And first thing people were saying is, oh, just stop oil. And people, they're not happy about this. And environmentalists and, oh, what about net zero? I think it's insane to try and go for net zero, and certainly by this randomly plucked date. Oh, it's got zero on the end 2050. Well versed on that. But even the people who think that's a good idea and think we can achieve it, which we can't, by the way, without basically ruining our economy and our lives forever. But even if that were possible, if you have an ounce of sanity, you know that we're still using oil and gas, and therefore, for decades to come, if we're going to use oil and gas, why don't we get it out of our seas or our earth rather than shipping it in from somewhere else? It is extraordinary how ill-informed and unknowledgeable the people who rant about this are. And yet no one seems to query it. And the journalists interviewing them don't seem to know the most basic facts about this.
I would say your viewpoint is highly logical, Julia. The problem is when you see interviews from people who Just Stop Oil, they focus on the hysteria and the hyperbole. When they get down to the nitty-gritty, the facts, the figures, the statistics, they actually don't know any of them on the oil and gas side. And we've talked about this before. How much comes from renewables? How much comes from oil and gas? If you put forward these points, that is typically by Just Stop Oil deemed, a pro-oil and gas view, but it's just the truth.
But we should all be pro oil and gas. Look, I've got lights on in this studio. I've got a pen. I've got a phone. I've got this mug. This mug will have been made using oil and gas because it's made from a factory. It's been
Exactly.
Everything we've got today, right now, the internet people use everything, all the equipment for that. It all involves oil and gas. These people are living in cuckoo land. I'm amazed. I love asking MPs about, what percentage of our energy needs, keyword, energy needs, at any one day, on average, is actually being produced by renewables. Just, I always say, within the nearest 10%, nearest 20%, I'll take whatever you want. They don't know. They don't know it's about 5 or 6%. They're under this complete illusion that sometime, even in 2050, or even by 2030, the Labour people, we're not going to have oil and gas anymore. I mean, they're literally mad.
Well, I mean, it's 4.3%. And I thought it was interesting in the government press release, they included the electricity statistic, not the energy statistic alone. Very interesting. The simple fact is, if we don't produce it here, we're going to have to import more and more from around the world. Now, on oil, we get it from our largest source of oil right now is the United States. Now, that's from fracking. They're fracking the Eagle Ford Shale in Texas. Our largest source of liquefied natural gas is the United States, and they're getting that by fracking the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania or the Barnett Shale in Texas. And our second largest supplier of liquefied natural gas is Qatar. So, I mean, if you look since 2018-19, the world has become increasingly unstable. So there is a really important national security point to this as well. But let's not sugarcoat this. There is not enough oil and gas in the North Sea to make the UK self-sufficient in oil and gas again. Whereas onshore, there's 50 years worth of gas sitting under
hold
the
on a
North
minute.
of England, but still
We're
under
running out. Don't you
moratorium.
remember? My whole childhood, we were being told oil and gas is going to run out. The irony being, of course, that if we do see widespread global warming, we will actually see the rather useful thing of whole swathes of, Siberia and Canada being unfrozen, wonderful tundra, unfrozen, fantastic. We'll be able to get the oil and gas out better.
Oh, there are some risks with that as well. There's no question in that. I think you can't go against that. But look, I mean, we are going to need it. Any argument that says we're not going to need oil and gas is completely wrong. We need to be focusing on it. The Just Stop Oil mantra is effectively let's import more and more, which is actually what are the economic, environmental, and geopolitical benefits of doing that? Which is why I think it is good that the government has said no, we're absolutely not listening to that. A concern, even when the Conservative government announced, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, the concern for investment is still Labour Party policy. I still don't know what they mean by no new licenses, a position against exploration.
Well, I know what they mean by it. They mean that we're all going to be poorer. It's just, we're all going to be poorer. Our lives are going to be rubbish. I'm old-fashioned. I just want the lights to stay on. I want my heating. I'm really old-fashioned. Thank you so much. Charles McAllister, always talking sense, former director at UK Onshore Oil.